Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, April 21st, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Wisconsin. Now, if you've been watching this channel in the day and age of the second Trump administration, you will know that we have been covering heavily a number of the special elections that have been taking place, but also the regularly scheduled elections that we've known were going to happen regardless of who was president, regardless of who was in the administration. And looking at the state of Wisconsin, certainly a battleground state from the last cycle, it was really interesting to see that Democrats won the state by roughly 10 points in what was expected to be a far more contentious Wisconsin Supreme Court race. And now this state Supreme Court race was extremely important for both sides of the aisle. It was an individual seat that, if it had gone to the Republican Party, would have flipped the partisan composition from being majority liberal to majority conservative. But Democrats followed through. They turned up and they turned out in a 10-point margin over Brad Schimel, the Republican nominee, or not necessarily Republican. This is a strictly nonpartisan race, but everybody knows whose side, who's rooting for who. In this case, Susan Crawford won by 10 points in a state that Donald Trump won in the last election, flipping it from Joe Biden's column from the 2020 election. Now, the state of Wisconsin wasn't the only state to hold elections on April 1st, 2025. The state of Florida did as well. And while this video is going to be focusing heavily on Wisconsin, a lot of the lessons that we are going to learn from Split Ticket with a phenomenal article here. I've been reading it and decided that I wanted to make a video talking about it because I think it does a great job at really dissecting what went well for Democrats and why their margin was so heavy. I think a lot of those lessons can be transferable to Florida and to other states too, where we're starting to see special elections really turn up the Democratic Party vote share and really change the way that the electorate engages with off-cycle and non-traditional elections. So looking at Split Ticket here, this article is written by Laksha Jain, Armin Thomas, did a great job really just dissecting what we can understand about the Wisconsin race. There's pretty much a two-pronged strategy that they really talk about here. One of them is voter persuasion on a much more muted note. They're looking at it from that lens of simply just, were voters changing their mind? Were voters going from Trump to now Susan Crawford, who identifies as left? And while there was some level of voter sentiment that changed, the big driving factor here, seemingly for Democrats, was turnout. A huge change in what type of electorate was turning out in the election resulted in the Democratic Party's victory of roughly 10 points. Now, they've done a great job at looking at the Wisconsin electorate turnout patterns, essentially seeing who's turning out to vote, who's voting for who, which areas are driving Democrats to be more engaged, less engaged, turning out, whatever it might be. And what we actually find that is quite interesting is that 2022 was about Democrat plus 1.6, which is really quite surprising, but honestly makes sense when you take a look at a lot of their down-ballot races, especially the gubernatorial race, that all the polls had indicated that the Republican Tim Michel was going to win in that race, or Tim Michaels. It's either with an S or it's not. Point is that the partisanship there was pretty good for the Democratic Party. In 2020, not as good, but still enough that Biden was able to win that election by a margin of roughly 0.6%. It was this time around in 2024 that the partisanship of what we saw in terms of what people have turned out and the election results here for who's backing who, Donald Trump won the base by won the election by 0.9% in Wisconsin. It was arguably a very close election. Very close, similar to that of the last one, and similar to that of the one before. Only Obama really in the 21st century has had the luxury of Wisconsin being a state that is a bit more lopsided in his favor. In 2008, it was 14 points. 2012, it was 7. But Wisconsin has always been quite competitive. John Kerry won it by 0.38. Al Gore won it by 0.22. So in the 21st century, barring Obama as someone who was very much heralded as this once-in-a-generation candidate, especially for the Rust Belt, Wisconsin has always been a competitive state. Now, forgive me, wrong article, but we'll get to that in a moment. What we're talking about in Wisconsin more heavily here is the turnout difference and how the turnout in 2025 resulted in a partisanship for the electorate of Democrat plus 7. Democrats turned out at an extensively higher rate because they are taking any and every opportunity to vote in elections. And while we can't write this off and say there was no persuasion, because obviously if the partisanship of the electorate is Democrat plus 7, Susan Crawford, in theory, should have won by just 7 if it was strictly just based on turnout, it also came down to a little bit of persuasion. But the big driving factor that gave Susan Crawford a landslide victory in comparison to what it was for Trump, 1% versus 10%, came down to who was turning out and how they were turning out, in which areas, in which regions, and what it might matter for the overall landscape for the next election cycle, 2026, and potentially even, yes, 2028. And what we learned is pretty much a lot of what we knew. What this article talks about is how when Donald Trump isn't on the ballot, you do find that there's an extensively lower turnout level amongst those lower propensity Republican voters that will turn out if Trump is on the ballot, that will go to the polls and will wait in line for hours upon hours if it means they get to vote for the president of the United States. But barring a constitutional crisis, Donald Trump will likely never be on the ballot for anything ever again. And that is going to be a major hurdle for Republicans as they look to bring in a huge new wave of young voters. We see this in the Yale Youth Poll. They talked about it earlier this week. You can take a look at it. Very interesting. But Gen Z, specifically a younger version of Gen Z, 18 to 24, is overwhelmingly more conservative than other younger voting groups that you're talking about, 24, to 28. You're talking about even millennials too seem to lean a little bit more towards the left than the youngest parts of Gen Z, which is my region of Gen Z. I'm 22 years old. But you see it. But the question is, do those voters turn out? That has been the age-old problem for Democrats, that they relied on low-propensity voters, that only in Obama's elections were their voters turning out, then they would get wiped out in the midterms, and they'd be back in 2012. They get wiped out in the midterms, and then Trump reshaped the landscape, but not necessarily in a way that benefits Republicans constantly in off-cycle elections. What I learned in AP Gov back in 2018 when I took it was that lower turnout elections always benefited Republicans. It was that the 2014 midterms, which had record low turnout in a midterm election, Republicans had the highest majority in the House of Representatives they had seen in this century alone. But what we are now seeing is that Democrats are invigorated to vote in every election when Donald Trump is president, even in ones where we're talking about a post-Dobbs era when Biden was president. Those special elections were good indicators for Democrats that they were getting in higher propensity voters. And that makes sense. What we saw here in 2025 in this election was exactly that. That the shift here, that those who turned out in the Wisconsin race leaned towards Kamala Harris by 7 percentage points. If you ran back the 2024 election with Wisconsin-style turnout from April's election nationally, Kamala Harris would have easily won the presidency. She would have won Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin. I mean, you talk about the shift here in turnout. You would have seen nearly every single battleground state go from being so favorable to Trump, or slightly favorable to Trump, to increasingly more favorable to Harris to a point that she would have won the election. Same thing if you take the numbers in Florida. But going further, they attribute 70% of Susan Crawford's win margin to just who was voting. That's what Democrats need to worry about and look to in the future. When you take a look at those numbers in the autopsy from 2024, it's actually quite interesting to know that if everybody in America had voted, Donald Trump probably would have done better. Because Donald Trump, similar to that of Obama, is invigorating low propensity voters because of who he is as a candidate, not necessarily someone who is giving Republicans constant wins because as is suggested by the name low propensity voters, they don't vote all the time. Democrats and Republicans are learning that very quickly. They talk about how Republicans might worry about this in the future because in midterm elections, you very often see that low propensity voters do not turn out in midterm elections, much less special elections or non-traditional elections, Supreme Court race, municipal elections. You're seeing that mayor elections across the country are starting to see Democratic tilt. In some cases, Democrats have flipped mayor elections that they haven't held in a very long time. And it's not because there's that much buyer's remorse. I think that Democrats have fallen into this consistent trap where they believe that huge segments of the population have buyer's remorse about their election. Not necessarily. A huge chunk of the American public, in fact, a higher proportion of the American public, believes that Donald Trump is doing a good job as president than nearly his entire first term. Donald Trump's approval rating, though in the negative, still remains to be higher than at 90% of his first term. Despite all of this news conversation and all of what we see in the media, a lot of it largely is noise. Yes, people are backtracking on supporting him on the economy, but they still largely support him on immigration, and that keeps his approval rating at -5 instead of -13, like his economy approval rating might suggest. And the point is that looking at, yes, there is that 30% of the margin coming from not necessarily turnout, but by persuasion. If 70% of it is coming from turnout, Democrats need to focus on turnout. Democrats need to get their base out, and Republicans arguably just simply aren't offering enough for Republicans wanting to turn out in other elections besides the ones where Donald Trump is on the ballot. That likely can explain why 2020 was so close, despite the polls saying that it wouldn't be. And again, that electorate was actually redder in Wisconsin than it was in 2022. And the other thing, too, that they mentioned here is Derek Van Orden. Now, you probably don't know his name, but you'll learn it as we talk about House races going into the next cycle. Derek Van Orden represents Wisconsin's 3rd district, a district that is absolutely, as they note, high up on the Democratic Party's radar as a potential win, because this 3rd district, if you take a look, in 2024, was decided by a margin of roughly 3 points. Back in 2024, on the same ballot, Donald Trump won this district by roughly 8 points. And when you take a look at what would be the first target for Democrats in 2026, it is districts like these. And guess what? Despite that Republican plus 8 percentage back in 2024, Kamala Harris actually comfortably won this electorate in April of 2025. Derek Van Orden, his candidate, his Democratic opponent, now running in this race yet again, she very well could win this race because she's giving him a run for his money, because it's not necessarily going to be a persuasion game, but rather a who turns out to vote game. And Democrats could very well see a margin similar to that of 2018 if things continue to go their way. And this new reform strategy the Democrats are finding themselves, what initially seemed to be a more passive approach to this second Trump administration, Democrats are finding, their mojo, right? They're finding their willingness to fight back. And they're redefining the modern day Republican Party. I told you that this article from Politico would come back. Why? Because it's true. Democrats made a huge deal of painting out Brad Schimmel, the Republican who was bankrolled by Elon Musk. Elon Musk had a huge vested interest in this Wisconsin race, held rallies for the Supreme Court candidate, unlike anything we've really ever seen in these hyper-partisan times. Point is that Democrats redefined the Wisconsin race as a referendum on Elon Musk. And I do think that can attribute that self to 30% of that persuasion shift. That there were some voters out there that were persuaded by the fact they didn't think the tariffs were going to work or were working. They didn't think Trump was doing enough on day one like he promised. Some people who might have voted for Trump because they felt that the left might have been getting too extreme, but now feel the right has gotten too extreme. And there certainly is a demographic of the electorate that might like Trump for being real and raw as they perceive it. But when it comes down to Elon Musk, they are no favor. They are no fan of Elon Musk. You can see that in the approval polls, Elon Musk far underperforms Trump, especially amongst young people too. Those things matter. And those things can persuade voters. And so while Democrats did not flip 1 in 10 voters from the last election to take the margin from being Republican +1 to Democrat +10, they did convince more voters to turn out from their base, to get their electorate to the voting booth. Because for them, it's about building an electorate that is conducive to a Democratic victory, not necessarily turning up and turning out every single voter. Because they're learning very quickly that, like Republicans did in the early 2010s, these higher propensity voters, the voters who are most engaged and most likely to vote, are the ones turning out to vote. And while Democrats, of course, would love to see higher turnout from the regions and the areas like Milwaukee, right, like those areas where Democrats do rely on heavy Democratic vote share, would like to see increased turnout. They are also learning, too, that their voters are very engaged at baseline. And in some ways, you don't want to touch that. Wisconsin is an interesting case, and it will be one that will likely be replicated in elections later down the line. Florida, we saw it. Wisconsin, we're seeing it. Virginia and New Jersey are up next, and it will be very fascinating to watch how those races truly end up. Because Democrats right now, I think, are potentially on the verge of redefining their electoral strategy. And they're finding their place, again, in this new day and age of American politics. And it will be something that I do think Democrats are going to have to do right if they want to win in 2028. But they have 3 years to do it. And they started doing things right in Wisconsin. They started doing things right in Florida. And it will be really interesting to watch how they navigate the next 3 years and decide to adapt their electoral strategy. Because there's ways to win, and ways to lose. And right now, it looks like Democrats are on track for victory in 2026. but a lot can change overnight in American politics. So huge shout out, Split Ticket. This was a great article. Thank you so much. I highly suggest that you guys fully read it out, take a look at the charts, take a look at the difference in turnout and difference in vote share. It will be definitely something that I'll be thinking about as I navigate my future of talking about electoral analysis. Really, really, really like this article. Thank you guys so much. And again, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch and a playlist for my 2025 second Trump administration analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.